Welcome to another edition of AUHSD Future Talks. I'm your host, Michael Matsuda, the superintendent of the Anaheim Union High School District, and which this show is all dedicated to our 30,000 students and their futures. And we've been blessed to have a very wide spectrum of experts and guests and speakers and national level folks to talk about jobs, careers, and the future, and the whole K-12, K-16 alignment. We're very blessed to have a national leader in transforming schools, Matt Coleman. Matt Coleman, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Mike. It's great to be here and appreciate having the opportunity.
Yeah, so Matt, you've had a long career as an educator, and now you're a consultant for a group called Inflexion, which you founded. Could you give us a little bit of a backstory, though, of your life as an educator and kind of what drives you, Matt?
Yeah, well, I'll go way back. Grew up in a small town in Oregon along the Columbia River, and about 10,000 people, and went to a small high school. And in my time there, really had a great many opportunities that are afforded kids in small towns. But one that wasn't necessarily afforded kids in small towns was just a real understanding of the world. And so, and the world outside of that small town. So I left there, went to the University of Oregon, and did my undergrad at the U of O, and then actually got into Teach for America and was placed in the Oakland Public Schools in Oakland, California, and got my start in education as a teacher in Oakland. And then fast forward,
what subject did you teach, man?
Science. I was a physical science teacher. Yeah. Basically physics and chemistry. And so from there, moved back up to Oregon, and relatively early in my career got into school administration, and was an assistant principal at the high school level, principal at the middle school level, principal at the high school level, and then was a secondary director and finished as an assistant superintendent before coming to Inflexion about 7 years ago now. And I came to Inflexion in part because of where I grew up. And what I mean by that is just the most of my classmates and my friends from growing up and from high school have really struggled, actually, because as the world changes and as the changing nature of specifically the world of work has accelerated over the last 15 to 20 years, it's left a lot of folks that were in my generation from small towns who weren't open to kind of the world in some different ways. It's kind of left them behind. And so, when I think about my work now at Inflexion, the great work that you all are doing in Anaheim with a future forward lens on where the world of work is going and how education needs to evolve. I go back to my friends who, spent 15 years at Martin Marietta Aluminum and had that industry just disappear. And they weren't in a position to adapt and flex and go with the flow in terms of the changing nature of work. And so all that, my early on experience and then my experience in large urban settings, coupled with my growing up in small rural remote, kind of bring me to this place of we got to really rethink schools with an eye towards the future, an eye towards, where my daughter, who's 15, will be mid to late career, which is in like 2056, I think, which is crazy to think about.
Wow. So you also have a relationship with David Conley, who's a sort of a leader in this shift into looking from looking at what are the metrics of career readiness. So could you share a little bit about your relationship with David, and who's been an advisor to the California State Board of Education?
Yeah, no, Dave was when I got my doctorate, was a faculty member. And so I first met Dave at that point in time. And Inflexion used to be the Educational Policy Improvement Center, which David Conley founded. The actual Inflexion and Epic, and Epic spans 20 years now. And Dave founded Epic, the Educational Policy Improvement Center, to really focus on policy innovation in the college and career readiness space. And my draw to his work was as an undergrad, actually when I was a vice principal at the high school level, and his relentless focus on this idea of a holistic vision for readiness, this mindset in today's terms that a cut score on Smarter Balanced and a transcript full of AP and IB scores really don't tell the full story in terms of student readiness. And the way that Dave frames it, the shorthand version is think, know, act, and go. That the ability to think, the ability to act or to own your own learning, and the ability to go, having a clear sense of who you are individually in the context of the ever-changing world around you, including the impact you're having on the world. That's the go part. That ultimately, those are, and we would argue, and the literature bears this out, the evidence would suggest it's more important than the traditional skills in that cut score on Smarter Balanced or that transcript full of courses that suggest that you have the content knowledge you need to be successful. And we're not saying that those things aren't important, not saying that reading, writing, math are not important. It's not saying that at all. Just saying in the context of being ready for the world, and really the world that continues to evolve, especially from a career or work perspective, that think, act, and go is where it's at. And so been connected to Dave for a long time now, and was blessed to have him ask me to come to Epic about 7 years ago. And take over for him as he pseudo retired. He's never fully going to ever retire, but pseudo retired, and we've evolved it to, and we renamed it Inflexion because we shift from policy work to school-based work.
Yeah, so it's interesting because what drew me to you guys was his work and his book, and he's written co-authored pieces around career readiness. With a colleague from Stanford, Linda Darling-Hammond, who's now head of the State Board of Education. So that we as a district were drawn to his work, and that led us to building a relationship with you. And now going forward with Inflexion, these concepts of owning your education, students owning it, students developing their own voice and purpose, leading to a meaningful career. I think that's something that really we have in common in terms of what we're trying to transform education to. And a lot of that is grounded in this sense of school identity, school vision, aligned to individual identity and vision. Could you talk a little bit more about what that means?
Yeah, and this was what you're getting at. We call it two anchors, and I always got to use my hands when I show this, but it's the two anchors, and you've got the one anchor that's critical is well, they're both critical, but the one anchor is a shared vision for readiness, and the 5 C's in Anaheim are a phenomenal example. That when you talk about a vision for readiness, it needs to be holistic, and we need to identify not the soft skills. And I when anybody says soft, I stop them. I say, quit saying that. These are the trending skills. These are actually academic skills, the ability to communicate and collaborate, and the emphasis on creativity and the ability to think critically. And what I love with what you guys do, the 5th C in terms of care and character and care. I always, did I get that right?
Character and compassion.
Thank you. Character and compassion. Care is compassion, but character and compassion. Right. That is when we talk about an anchor of a holistic vision for readiness, that is what it is. Now, when you think about secondary schools, and most people listening or watching this have either lived in secondary schools or are working in secondary schools. The secondary schools were set up really against outcomes that were connected to content knowledge and skills. And specifically at the high school level, even the ability to read and write and do math were never really, they weren't necessarily saw as the collective as being responsible for. They were seen as the math department or the English department or whatnot. And so when you when you think about this idea of a holistic vision for readiness, that is kind of a foreign concept in terms of the purpose of schools is to develop the whole child, and specifically high schools and middle schools or junior highs. And so part of our work in trying to support the system to think differently is that we've got at the individual site level, we need to get people dialing in and focused on and working collectively towards a shared vision for readiness that is holistic. The other piece, the other what we call anchor, the two anchors. The first is a shared vision for readiness. The other is organizational identity, and this comes from organizational theory. If you're familiar at all with Peter Senge and some of the Margaret Wheatley, some of the classic organizational theorists, this idea that as an organization, and our work is with schools, as a school or as a district. You've got to have clarity of what your values and your beliefs are and what your mental models are. And from a secondary perspective, secondary schools, and we've seen this in the couple hundred that we've been engaging with and looking at over the last couple of years, they really struggle with this because the original identity, the values and the beliefs and the mental models of 20th century schools are still pervasive in the 21st century. And I'll just give you one little example. This idea of the power of the collective. You have to believe in the power of the collective. In other words, we are working together. And what I see in way too many schools is I'll go walking down the hallway and pop into 5 or 6 different classrooms. And even when I see phenomenal teaching happening across all 5 or 6 classrooms, the only thing that really connects those classrooms for kids are the hallways. It's not something like the 5 C's, and then that's the power in having a shared vision for readiness, which is the type of mental model that like the 5 C's. If I'm walking down the halls of Anaheim High School, where my dad graduated in 1958, if I'm walking down those hallways today, what I'm confident I would see is I'd go from classroom to classroom and I'd see compassion being modeled. I'd see it being developed explicitly. I would see creativity being honored and the space for that. I would see the 5 C's. That would connect the classrooms. For me, as just a passive observer, an active observer, but more importantly for the kids who are going from classroom to classroom to classroom. That's built on this mindset of the power of the collective. And that's what we look for in schools. Part of the way you get at it is you set that anchor. You set the 5 C's as this foundational piece, and this is what we're all working towards. Therefore, we should see it every period, every day. And that's the work that we as an organization do, is we're trying to help schools set those 2 anchors, get really clear, and then start working to align their practices so that ultimately kids are prepared for the 21st century in a way that is very different from what it was in the 20th century.
Now, you work with literally hundreds of schools across states, even countries now, and trying to sort of, help, set those 2 anchors in these institutions. And I guess my big question is, you're trying to get this collective capacity moving, the power of the collective. I think the big, gorilla in the room is the much of American vision has been set by the traditional metrics, and that becomes the culture of one of those anchors, right? It's not holistic. Everybody, they might say it's holistic, but it's really not, because when you go into the schools, they're spending their time on improving the traditional test scores. How do we overcome that?
One, we got to be bold, and we need more districts like Anaheim, and I could throw some other examples out there: Merced Union High School District, Vista Unified down in North San Diego County. I mean, there are leaders in their districts, and there are teacher leaders that are moving out and saying these things are important. I do actually think the pandemic kind of shone a light on some of these things, and I think we need to, dare I say, use this. Was certainly a crisis that touched everybody, No one has been immune to the impact of the pandemic, obviously, and unfortunately in terms of health and well-being, but also just in the sense of schools and kind of the holes that are there. And I'll give you one little example. A lot of kids, the high school level specifically, in the failed and or did not earn credit when pushed into distance learning, especially initially, as there was some, schools did some nice work, they got some things figured out. It's been fascinating to watch people wrestle with the why behind that. And, we've been working with about 40 plus schools this last year that were all, as they were going through it. And as we processed individually and in smaller groups with schools we were working with, one of the things that kept rising to the surface was kids don't know how to own their own learning. We don't actually systematically develop that. And so when pushed into an environment where they actually had to own the bulk of their learning, and they were the ones that got to choose whether they turn their screen on or even open their computer. I mean, the whole shift of ownership immediately went to the kids, and our kids weren't prepared for it. And we know this from the literature around why kids aren't successful post-secondary in universities, is this inability or this lack of ability to own their own learning, to self-manage. Well, that resulted in a bunch of kids, significant 3-4 times in all kinds of schools, demographically, geographically, everybody saw this huge spike. Well, the root cause of that huge spike is kids, we don't have an outcome as part of our accountability framework that's around self-management, that's around helping kids develop the skills to own their own learning.
Matt, do you think that teachers own their own teaching?
Actually, I do.
In order to get there, right? Don't the teachers have to own it too?
No, absolutely. And there has to be a level of flexibility and autonomy given. At the same time, we have to be careful, because I would argue, and this is another kind of a little hashtag that we use, this idea that we have independent contractors working independently. So there's almost too much. When I say too much ownership, there's too much in terms of, well, I teach physics and therefore Newtonian mechanics is the end all be all. And as long as I teach the content well, I'm all good. One could argue that's a form of ownership in terms of I get to define,
And that's why the trending skills are so important.
Absolutely.
That's the ownership right there for the teachers. If they own that, they can then build lessons in which students can truly own their learning.
Absolutely. And what we would argue, when I talk about these two anchors, if you think of the best organizations you've ever been a part of, or the best organizations you've ever heard of or know of, what makes them the best is there's a shared identity, there's shared values and beliefs and mental models that's shared across the organization, and there's a shared purpose, or in schools, a shared vision for readiness. These two things are so important, because when you bring teachers in, you want them to want to be part of the collective. They need to see themselves in it. I joke about this, I'm a preacher's kid, having grown up in a church, and if somebody moves new to a community and they are quote unquote Christian, then they don't look in the phone book and identify the first Christian church that they see, and they say, oh, that's where I'm going to go to church. They actually will take 6, 7, 8 months, and they'll visit different churches, and they're looking for the right fit. They're looking for the values and the beliefs and the purpose of the church. And when the
culture, right? They're looking for that culture.
Exactly. And that's a piece that we're trying to help schools create and develop, so that we can realize the power of the collective. So to your point, the ownership piece that I do believe teachers own their own learning and their own teaching in that sense. But we actually want teachers, and we want to support schools where teachers recognize that their individual contribution is towards a collective, with something like the 5 C's has been a great example.
So, in the moments we have left, I want to spend a little time picking your brain as to what's next. What do you see the future of? Where's education going, especially higher education with Google coming in, some of these big folks creating their own certificates and things like that. What do you think is going to happen in the next 5 to 10 years with education?
Oh, with higher education, and I think this idea of learners, learning, post-secondary learning, not confined to what we traditionally have thought. I think there's going to be all kinds of evolution. We already see it in industry. And what I mean in your example with Google is a great example, and the different huge companies are doing some different things, but so are community colleges. I mean, it's really interesting. I mean, we have programmers. We do a lot of work with the College Board around AP, and we literally have a team of programmers. When we go out to hire, when we've got a new position, we're asking for some explicit skills, and then we're hiring to our values and our beliefs. We want somebody who's adaptable and flexible and can collaborate and communicate. So we identify these skills. Now in the future, or I mean, the future is now. I mean now, but certainly in the future, kids and adults and whatnot can go and develop a set of very explicit skills, which is going to open opportunities in terms of different industries. And it's not going to require you to go get a 4-year degree or some of that, again, kind of more that 20th century thinking. So the skill acquisition, the learning, the technical aspects, I think are going to become more and more and more accessible, both for entry-level positions, but then career advancement, that aren't necessarily going to require the traditional way that we've thought about higher education. And that's definitely my take for what it's worth. What becomes important from a K-12 perspective is that what isn't happening in those settings is kids and young adults and adults are not learning. They're getting the technical, the trending skills of being flexible and adaptive and able to communicate and able to collaborate. All of those trending skills need to be developed in the secondary space, in the K-12 space, and we have to rise that occasion. There's so much happening with automation that most entry-level jobs across all areas of career and industry are being automated. And a lot of the entry-level jobs is where if you didn't develop the ability to communicate and collaborate and all those things, that's where you learn to do it. And if you learn to do it there, you were able to advance. Those jobs are going away. They're being automated. So all of this points to what needs to be a revolution in K-12, where specifically we are elevating the development of the trending skills. That needs to be the priority. And that's my hope is, that we in partnership with people like you and Anaheim and others can kind of help push that, both from a practical standpoint, kind of what's happening in schools today, but then also from a policy standpoint, specifically around building accountability systems that make a heck of a lot more sense for what we know kids need to be successful in life.
But this is kind of my final question. But the accountability piece, isn't that the hard part with, in terms of these trending skills, right? They're difficult to measure, and yeah. We're struggling with that as well. What advice do you give to districts like us that are trying to make that transition?
Yeah, I think they are difficult, and my doctorate actually is in measurement design, so I understand some of the challenges maybe a little bit more deeply than most in this space. What's not difficult to measure is whether or not the system is actually providing the opportunities for kids to develop those skills. So I mentioned this, earlier in our talk here that I could be, going down the hallways, pop into 5 or 6 different classrooms at Anaheim High School, and I actually know what to look for. Now I know what to look for because you all created it, right? In terms of you've got some look for tools around, looking for communication being developed, looking for collaboration. I can actually go in and measure that. And in the sense of the 5 or 6 classrooms, I saw this teacher providing this opportunity in this kind of a way for students. Here's what's great. You teach your kids up on what are the 5 C's. Ask them in the last 2 weeks, how often have you had an opportunity to X, Y, or Z? there's different ways to measure whether the system is demonstrating responsibility, is actually doing what it takes for kids to have the opportunities to develop these skills. They're very hard for a variety of reasons. They're very hard to measure at the individual student level, but they are not hard to measure, and you can elevate student voice in this process. They're not hard to measure in terms of whether or not those opportunities to develop those skills are there. And we would advocate hard that we need to shift accountability off the shoulders of kids, as it's been, right? It's really kind of fallen on kids, and onto the shoulders of the system, using ideas of measures of systemic responsibility.
Well, I can tell already we're going to have a part 2 of our future talk here. Matt, on behalf of our 30,000 students and their families, we're proud to be a partner with Matt Coleman and Inflexion. So thank you for your time, Matt.
Oh, thank you, Mike. And we appreciate you, your district, your community, most importantly, your students. So thank you.